people have this perception that Western media have a biased view, or hold biased views against China. For example, they come to China with a sense of sort of superiority. They look at China's so-called negative sides much more often than they look at the positive sides. Do you think there is a distinction between positive coverage of a country and negative coverage of a country?
Well, the views that Chinese people have of Western media are very similar, but probably not as hostile as the views of many of our politicians of Western media. Nowadays, everybody seems to hate the Western media, so it's not unique at all to China. I don't consider myself an expert on the coverage because I don't read it all. First of all, there's a structural feature about news. It's a very interesting feature of the news business as a business. I imagine it applies within China too, that people, and this goes ultimately down to the consumers, the people who read it and use it. People are much more excited and engaged by negative stories than positive stories. So if there's a disaster somewhere in the world, it will be in the front page press. If something goes incredibly well, it won't be in the press at all, because the press focuses on disasters. It's particularly true of political coverage, but also social coverage. So there's a general tendency for the news media to focus on negative stories everywhere. And it's one of the reasons people sort of hate newspapers. So I think that's not unique to our coverage of China. It's very much a characteristic of our coverage of our own countries. The negative is always dominant. And second, I suppose the news media think of themselves as, perhaps in exaggeration, a sort of there to be a check on power, hold power accountable. So there's a tendency to say, well, the people in power say X, why is X wrong? And that's probably regarded as particularly controversial here because the Chinese government likes to control the media. And so they see, understandably, from their point of view, the media running around saying, but you say X about your country and it isn't true, get to be very unpopular. Those are, if you like, general phenomena, not unique to China in any way. So politicians hate media everywhere. I think it's very important. I'm not saying the people, they vary. But generally, by the way, in the West, journalists are regarded as a pretty low form of life. So there's nothing special. Now, the question of the Western approach to China is I think it probably goes beyond the media, but far beyond the media. How does the West view China broadly? It's difficult to summarize, of course, because it's so complicated and people have different views. But the media imports certain attitudes. Media are by and large written by liberal, in the American sense, Westerners. And they probably have the following sorts of attitudes. They don't much like the Chinese political system, instinctively, as I've said. We don't find the idea of a communist country very easy to understand or accept. And it is important to remember the Cold War was important. And the Cold War was a conflict between democracy and communism, and was seen as an ideological conflict. So in that context, the political system of China was on the other side. So people are very suspicious of that. Until recently, it's perhaps a bit less now, Westerners tended to think democracy was a better system. Maybe we don't think that, but that's an issue. Then, obviously, the government here likes to put forward the immense achievements, which are obviously immense economically. But there are lots of problems in China, and it's natural for the media to want to go around and find out about the problems, because as I've said, bad news is the story. And it's particularly natural that they want to do this when the government is touting all the successes. So they go around looking for the bad stories. That's part of what they think of as their job. They do this in the West, very much so. So it's nothing unique. I don't think that's unique. The suspicion of the political system is specific to China. Now, a more interesting question is there a tendency to be particularly hostile to features of the Chinese social culture and so forth? I don't know. There are some issues that probably have arisen in the Western media, gender issues, for example, which I think are in no ways unique in the attitude to China, but are seen as important to the West because the West is very fixated on gender issues now. So, bias in the sex ratio between men and women is an issue for the West and observers of China. That's probably inevitable. So we look through China through modern Western eyes, and modern Western eyes are very different from those of 60, 70 years ago. We have our own concerns, and everybody looks at this country in terms of our own preoccupations of the moment, which change. Now, the final issue, which I think let's be honest about, is we have to be careful about, and I do wonder about this, which is how much of the coverage of the view of the West of China is governed by fear. I mean, this is an interesting question. China is an enormous country. It is going to be enormously powerful. Almost certainly it will be the world's biggest economic power. It will therefore become a dominant political factor in the world. This makes it's a non-Western country, will always be a non-Western country. I think it frightens Westerners. The Westerners have been they've got completely used to instinctively, as it were, it's not an instinct, but to running the world. They think in some strange way that it's natural. They don't want to lose this position, but China is clearly going to change that. And so it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the points I made about the political system, the feeling that it's not a natural political system, the hostility to it, that's, as it were, contingent upon very specific things. But the fundamental question is, do we find the rise of China exhilarating but also terrifying? I think the answer to that is most intelligent observers find it exhilarating but also terrifying because we don't know what it's going to mean for our world.